For almost 170 years, the fate of the Franklin expedition was one of history's greatest mysteries.
The Franklin expedition sailed into the Arctic with the confidence of an empire certain that machinery and discipline could master any frontier. Yet the calm horizon concealed a transformation they could neither predict nor escape. As the ships pressed deeper into narrowing channels, the ice began to change, setting in motion a sequence that would outlive every man aboard. Departure into promise and uncertainty. When HMS Erebus and HMS Terror left Greenhithe in May 1845, their departure carried the unmistakable energy of a nation convinced it stood on the edge of a triumph that would define an era. The two vessels, strengthened with iron plating, reinforced beams, and newly adapted steam engines, represented the height of Victorian engineering, allowing their crews to believe that human innovation could transcend the most forbidding environments. Families watched from the shoreline as the ships moved steadily into the estuary, and contemporary newspapers described the expedition with a mix of admiration and certainty, as though the Northwest Passage were already waiting to be claimed. On board, the officers prepared formal dinners, inspected carefully stocked compartments, and discussed the advantages of their modern equipment with the confidence of men carrying the full prestige of the Royal Navy. The sailors, accustomed to long voyages, sensed that this journey differed from ordinary deployments because it promised both scientific acclaim and geopolitical significance. Every detail reinforced the impression that the venture had been planned with exceptional precision. Yet the very strength that defined the mission also concealed its vulnerability, since the crew could not recognize how profoundly the Arctic environment would challenge assumptions that seemed unshakable in the sheltered waters of Britain. A world that closed around them. By the time Erebus and Terror reached Lancaster Sound, the crew still believed that each narrowing strait marked steady progress toward the Pacific. Yet the environment around them had already begun shifting in ways no chart or calculation could anticipate. The Arctic's seasonal rhythm, typically familiar to experienced navigators, entered an anomalous phase during the winter of 1846, when temperatures fell far below historical patterns and accelerating pressure ridges began welding channels shut, long before the expedition expected serious obstruction. The men attributed the early freeze to ordinary variability, unaware that modern ice core studies would later reveal that the period between 1846 and 1848 produced some of the thickest, coldest multi-year sea ice in 7 centuries. This extraordinary climatic event meant that once the ships became immobilized near King William Island, their confinement deepened each month, welding hulls to an expanding mass of ice that transformed the vessels from mobile platforms into unwilling winter stations. Life aboard remained orderly at first, with routines intended to maintain discipline, health, and morale. Yet, subtle signs of strain emerged as daylight shrank, and the crew realized that escape would require either an early thaw or a stroke of extraordinary luck. The engines, which promised independence from the wind, could not operate under layers of ice that grew denser as the months passed, and the coal stored for emergencies diminished more rapidly than planners had projected. The officers maintained confidence in their scientific instruments, but the failure of leads to reopen signaled that the environment had shifted into a pattern they could neither measure nor counteract. By the second winter, the expedition had moved from calculated delay into a state where the Arctic dictated every possibility, gradually closing the window for retreat while reshaping the choices the men could make. The first clues of collapse. When no further reports arrived after the expedition passed Baffin Bay, the Admiralty initially assumed that the ships had been delayed by an inconvenient season rather than a catastrophic setback, since Arctic voyages often slipped behind schedule without immediate concern. Months turned into years, however, and the absence of any communication began eroding the confidence that had surrounded the mission's departure. Search ships launched in widening arcs across the Canadian Arctic, yet each voyage returned with little more than conjecture, reinforcing an unsettling truth that the ice had concealed the entire expedition with remarkable efficiency. The first concrete evidence emerged in 1850, when investigators discovered 3 graves on Beechey Island, along with remnants of the winter camp, that suggested the men had begun their journey with discipline intact. These findings provided reassurance that the expedition had functioned normally during its earliest months, although later forensic studies revealed elevated lead levels in the remains. which raised new questions about whether the tinned provisions intended to ensure health had instead impaired judgment during crucial decisions. As the search continued, explorers encountered Inuit communities who described meeting starving Europeans farther south. Yet these accounts were frequently dismissed because they conflicted with European assumptions about where the ship should have drifted or been abandoned. This dismissal inadvertently concealed some of the most accurate testimony ever collected about the expedition's fate. Meanwhile, scattered artifacts retrieved from the ice, including tools, clothing, and fragments of boats, painted a picture of a group forced into desperate movement across terrain that offered no protection and little hope of return. Each discovery hinted that the collapse of the expedition had been gradual rather than sudden, shaped by dwindling resources, environmental extremes, and decisions made under mounting psychological strain. The silence that had baffled Britain for years slowly took on new meaning as evidence revealed the scale of hardship that overwhelmed the crew, the abandonment, and the march across the ice. The most revealing breakthrough arrived with the 1859 discovery of a message left beneath a cairn on King William Island, which recorded an optimistic 1847 note later surrounded by a second statement describing an entirely altered reality. The amended entry explained that Erebus and Terror had remained trapped since September 1846, that Sir John Franklin had died in June 1847, and that the surviving officers and crew abandoned both ships in April 1848 to begin a march toward the Back River. This document, written in a steady naval hand, conveyed the magnitude of the crisis without emotional flourish. Yet every detail implied a situation in which months of confinement, dwindling supplies, deteriorating health, and eroding leadership converged to make departure appear the only remaining option. The decision to leave reinforced how thoroughly the environment had outmaneuvered the expedition's original strategy, since marching hundreds of kilometers across shifting ice demanded stamina that even healthy sailors would have struggled to maintain. As later searches uncovered discarded equipment, skeletal remains, and a boat mounted on a sled, investigators recognized how quickly the southward journey devolved into a contest for survival against cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Inuit accounts described encounters with men weakened beyond recognition, moving slowly and carrying burdens that offered no practical advantage in such conditions, suggesting that the psychological weight of maintaining identity and duty persisted even as physical strength collapsed. Forensic examinations of scattered bones revealed patterns consistent with starvation and the final extremities of human desperation, underscoring that the march was not a single organized retreat, but a sequence of fragmented attempts to preserve life, under circumstances no expeditionary planning could address. The ice gives up its secrets. More than a century later, the mystery surrounding the lost ships endured because neither charts nor early search attempts had identified a plausible resting place. Yet, Inuit oral histories consistently pointed toward waters farther south than European investigators expected. This discrepancy persisted until the early 21st century, when researchers finally combined advanced marine technology with sustained collaboration from Inuit communities who understood the region's ice patterns with generational depth. During the 2014 Victoria Strait expedition, a sonar sweep from a Canadian vessel revealed an anomaly lying only 11 meters below the surface, whose outline carried the unmistakable symmetry of a 19th century warship. When remotely operated vehicles descended through the frigid water, the cameras illuminated a hull that appeared strikingly intact, preserved by low salinity, cold temperatures, and an anoxic environment that slowed decay to an extraordinary degree. Archaeologists soon realized that the ship had come to rest gently rather than violently, indicating that Erebus likely drifted or was reboarded before sinking in a controlled descent. Bronze cannons, porcelain dishes, and navigational instruments remained in place, while partially intact cabins displayed furniture and personal belongings exactly where crew members had left them. These preserved details created a vivid record of daily life, interrupted by a crisis that unfolded over many months rather than a single catastrophic moment. The careful arrangement of objects suggested routines maintained deep into the expedition's struggle, yet the presence of hurriedly abandoned spaces revealed moments when decisions had to be made quickly under deteriorating conditions. The discovery provided not only archaeological insight, but also emotional immediacy, since the ship's condition conveyed both the professionalism of the crew and the accelerating desperation that shaped their final months. As researchers mapped the wreck with photogrammetry and laser scanning, Erebus transformed from legend into an exhaustive historical record that deepened understanding of the expedition's collapse. Terror in perfect stillness and the final theory. 2 years after the discovery of Erebus, another revelation emerged when a community member from Gjoa Haven guided researchers to a sheltered bay where unusual ice behavior had been reported for generations. When surveyors deployed sonar across the quiet inlet in 2016, the returning image displayed a ship so intact that archaeologists struggled to reconcile its condition with the hardships documented in historical accounts. HMS Terror rested upright on the seafloor, with window panes unbroken, cabins visibly furnished, and storage compartments appearing undisturbed, as though the crew had stepped away only briefly rather than vanished into the most enigmatic disappearance in Arctic exploration. This extraordinary preservation suggested that the vessel had not been crushed by drifting ice, contradicting long-standing assumptions that both ships succumbed to identical fates at similar times. The condition of terror inspired a refined hypothesis. A contingent of survivors may have returned to one of the ships after the initial abandonment and attempted to sail, or drifted to a safer anchorage during a brief seasonal thaw. Such an effort, requiring coordination and determination under profound physical strain, indicated that the collapse of the expedition included moments of resilience that complicated earlier narratives of uniform decline. The ship's protected resting place allowed this final chapter to endure in remarkable clarity. The two ships now rest in a world once determined to erase them, offering a final reminder that history survives when patience, knowledge, and perspective converge. If their story moved you, consider subscribing, because every discovery deepens our understanding of how human ambition meets the unforgiving edges of the earth.